prison built on secrets. Long before Mateo Cruz's blood stained the gravel, Blackridge Maximum Security Prison had earned its reputation as a graveyard for men who were still breathing. Its concrete walls rose from the outskirts of a forgotten industrial town, built during the height of the drug wars in the 1980s. Back then, politicians had promised it would be a monument to law and order. Instead, it became a monument to brutality. From the outside, Blackridge looked like a fortress. Rows of watchtowers, razor wire curling like barbed halos, floodlights that turned night into day. Inside, however, it was less a prison and more a kingdom carved up by gangs, guards, and ghosts. Every block had its ruler, every hallway whispered with deals. Power wasn't written in rulebooks. It was carved into flesh, paid in cigarettes, and enforced with blades. Detective Laura Jensen had heard the stories before she ever set foot inside. Riots that ended in mass graves. Guards who vanished after payday. Inmates who walked into solitary confinement and were never seen again. The official records painted Blackridge as a high-security success. The reality was darker, and now Cruz's death had ripped that darkness into the open. She needed answers. In her temporary office, a barren interrogation room cleared for her use, Jensen spread the files she'd gathered across the table. Reports of contraband. Memos about food shortages. Complaints from lower-level staff that never made it past the warden's desk. Each piece seemed small, meaningless, but together they painted a picture of a system riddled with cracks. At the heart of it all was Warden Harold King. On paper, King was a decorated administrator, 25 years in corrections, lauded for efficiency and discipline. In reality, whispers said he ruled through fear, rewarding guards who turned a blind eye and burying those who didn't. Cruz's final note, "The boss wears a badge," kept echoing in her mind. Jensen requested older case files from the Department of Corrections. What she uncovered unsettled her, a string of unsolved deaths stretching back over a decade. Men strangled in their cells. Others stabbed in blind spots where cameras conveniently malfunctioned. Every one of those incidents shared two things: missing surveillance footage and reports signed by King. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. This wasn't just about a single murder. Blackridge was rotten from its foundations. Her thoughts were interrupted by Ramirez, still pale from the knife wound he'd sustained in the riot. He carried a folder, his hand trembling as he set it down. "You should see this," he muttered. Inside were logs of incoming shipments. Weekly deliveries of food, medical supplies, and maintenance equipment. At first glance, nothing unusual. But Ramirez pointed to the numbers. "See the weights? Look here. Last month, the kitchen received a produce order listed at 2,000 pounds. When I checked the crates yesterday, the actual contents added up to half that." Jensen's stomach tightened. Half a ton unaccounted for. And no one noticed? Or no one wanted to notice? Cruz was right, she whispered. The weapons came in through the kitchen. Smuggled under their noses. Ramirez shook his head. "Not under their noses, detective. With their help." That night, Jensen walked the prison with a different lens. She saw the guards not as keepers of order, but as men who might be lining their pockets. She noticed the way certain doors were left unlocked, how some officers exchanged knowing glances with inmates. Power flowed both ways in Blackridge, and it didn't stop at the razor wire. The next morning, Jensen received a message slipped under her door. No signature. Just two words scrawled in hurried handwriting. "Trust no one." She folded it carefully. It could have been paranoia, a prank, or a warning. But in Blackridge, where loyalty was as rare as clean air, she took it seriously. Still, she pressed forward. Her next step was to confront the inmates who held sway, the so-called shot callers, who ran the blocks from behind their bars. If Cruz had been silenced, they would know why. Her first meeting was with Reaper, the tattooed giant who had led the charge during the riot. He sat across from her in shackles, his arms a tapestry of inked skulls and crosses. His grin was wolfish. "You think Cruz was special?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Cruz thought he was playing chess, but he didn't realize he was just a pawn. When pawns step out of line, they get knocked off the board. Simple as that. "Who ordered it?" Jensen pressed. Reaper leaned back, chains rattling. "You already know. But let me give you a piece of advice, detective. In this place, the ones with the keys and the ones with the knives, they work together. Doesn't matter what badge you wear. Everyone's bought, one way or another." His eyes glimmered with amusement, as if he enjoyed watching her struggle with the truth. When Jensen left the room, her pulse was racing. The warning note, the missing shipment weights, the history of unexplained deaths, it all pointed to the same conclusion. Blackridge wasn't just corrupt. It was built on corruption. And now, with the riot tearing through its veins and weapons leaking into inmate hands, the entire prison was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The only question was, who would light it first? Secondly, the scrap of cloth. Detective Laura Jensen couldn't shake the image of Cruz's fist, clenched tight even in death. That scrap of fabric had been his final act, his dying message. Not words, not a name, but a clue small enough to slip past the killers who thought they'd silenced him. She kept it sealed in an evidence bag, the black weave of the cloth catching the light as she held it up again in her office. It was unmistakably from a guard's uniform, the heavy-duty kind worn only by Blackridge staff. To most people, a shred of fabric meant nothing. But to Jensen, it was proof that Cruz's killer had walked the halls with authority, keys jangling at his waist. The challenge was narrowing it down. Blackridge employed over 200 officers, many of them hardened men who saw their job less as law enforcement and more as survival. Which one of them had stood close enough to Cruz, blade in hand, to leave behind this trace? She started with the basics, the uniforms themselves. Officially, all gear was issued through the prison supply office. But when she requested the logbooks, the clerk looked at her with wide, nervous eyes. Some records got lost, he stammered. Lost? Jensen repeated flatly. Or destroyed? He didn't answer. Later, as she pressed him harder, he cracked. Not all the gear comes through here, okay? Some of it gets borrowed. Brought in from outside. Extra vests, boots, jackets. Nobody checks because nobody wants to check. You get me? She did. Which meant the scrap might not belong to any official uniform at all. It could have been part of a smuggled set, used by a guard moonlighting for something far darker. Jensen returned to the yard where Cruz had bled out. The gravel still bore faint stains, though most of it had been washed away under the guise of sanitation. She crouched near the spot, her eyes scanning the angles, the blind spots, the towers looming above. 30 seconds. That was all it took. 30 seconds where Cruz had vanished from the cameras. And in those 30 seconds, a man in uniform had cut his throat. Detective, a voice drawled behind her. She turned to find Officer Bennett leaning against the fence, arms crossed, a smirk curling his lips. His shoulder was still bandaged from their scuffle in the freezer, but he carried himself like a man untouchable. You look like you're chasing ghosts, he said. Funny, Jensen replied coldly, that a ghost left this behind. She held up the evidence bag with the fabric scrap. For a fraction of a second, his eyes flicked toward it. Just a flicker, but enough for Jensen to catch. You think that means something? Bennett scoffed. Uniforms tear all the time. Doesn't prove a damn thing. Maybe not, she said evenly. But Cruz thought it mattered enough to die holding on to it. Bennett's grin faltered just slightly. Then he pushed off the fence, shrugging. Careful, detective. You keep poking your nose in places it doesn't belong, you might end up like him. Jensen's jaw tightened as she watched him walk away. It wasn't a confession, but it was close enough to raise the hairs on her neck. That night, unable to sleep, she spread her notes across the table again. She circled the connections. Cruz's note about the kitchen, the missing shipment weights, the fabric scrap, the riot that had conveniently erupted just as she uncovered the crate. Piece by piece, the puzzle pointed inward, not outward. This wasn't just inmate violence. It was orchestrated, controlled, directed by someone with both access and authority. The following day, she cornered Warden King in his office. His desk was spotless, every file neatly stacked, the smell of expensive cigars clinging to the air. You know what this is? Jensen asked, tossing the evidence bag onto his desk. King didn't even glance at it. A torn rag. It's from a guard's uniform. Cruz held on to it until his last breath. He was trying to tell us who killed him. King sighed, leaning back in his chair. Detective, Blackridge is a powder keg. Men die here. Sometimes by shifts, sometimes by guards who lose their temper. That's the reality. Don't romanticize it. This wasn't a shiv and it wasn't lost temper. This was execution, Jensen shot back. And I think you know why. For the first time, King's eyes hardened, a flicker of menace behind his calm mask. Be careful what you accuse me of. You're a guest in my house. And in my house, guests who overstay their welcome have a way of disappearing. Jensen leaned forward, unflinching. Then maybe it's time the world sees what's really happening in your house. The tension hung thick, electric. She knew she was pushing too hard, too fast. But backing down wasn't an option anymore. When she left, Ramirez was waiting outside. His face was pale, his wounds stitched but still tender. Detective, he whispered, glancing around, we've got another problem." He handed her a folder he'd swiped from the infirmary. Inside were medical reports, injuries to guards that didn't add up. Lacerations, bruises, fractures. The official explanations read like fiction: slipped on wet floor, accidental fall, inmate assault during routine check. But one in particular caught Jensen's eye. A guard treated the same night Cruz died. Wound on his forearm, described as a deep tear. The timing matched perfectly with the scrap in Cruz's fist. The name on the report, Officer Mark Bennett. Her pulse quickened. The scrap wasn't just a clue, it was a fingerprint made of cloth. Cruz had torn it from Bennett's uniform as he fought for his life. And now, she had the first piece of hard evidence tying Bennett directly to the murder. But as she looked up from the file, Ramirez's face told her what she already feared. "Detective," he said quietly, "if we go after Bennett, we're not just going after him. We're going after everyone protecting him. And that includes the warden." Jensen's fingers tightened on the folder. She knew he was right. But Cruz's voice echoed in her mind, through the shaky scrawl in his hidden note. "The boss wears a badge." It was time to follow that trail no matter where it led. Thirdly, the code of silence. Detective Laura Jensen had the evidence in her hands. A medical report that placed Officer Mark Bennett at the center of Mateo Cruz's murder. A torn uniform. A wound on his forearm. A scrap clenched in a dead man's fist. It was the kind of connection prosecutors dream about. But in Blackridge, evidence was only half the battle. The other half was surviving long enough to use it. When Jensen approached the Internal Affairs office with the file, the response was chilling. The officer on duty, a broad-shouldered veteran named Harris, barely glanced at the papers before sliding them back across the desk. "You don't want to push this," he said, his voice low. "Bennett murdered an inmate," Jensen snapped. "And he's tied to a smuggling pipeline. You're telling me that doesn't matter?" Harris leaned closer, his eyes flat and tired. "I'm telling you, no one here is going to touch him. Not me, not the warden, not anyone. You make this official, you'll find your paperwork buried in red tape until it disappears. Or worse, you'll disappear with it." Jensen stared at him, her pulse hammering. "So that's it? You all just cover for each other while this place rots?" His expression didn't change. "It's not about covering. It's about survival. The code of silence keeps us alive in here. Break it and you won't last a week." She left the office with her blood boiling. The code of silence. She'd heard of it before, whispered in other prisons. An unspoken pact where guards closed ranks no matter the crime. In Blackridge it was ironclad. The staff wouldn't talk, maybe the inmates would. She arranged another round of interviews, starting with Darnell Little D. Hughes. He sat across from her, shackles rattling as he tapped a restless rhythm on the table. His eyes darted to the corners of the room where cameras hummed softly. "You wanted to tell me more about Cruz?" Jensen said carefully. Little D shook his head, sweat gleaming on his temple. "I can't. You don't get it. Talking got Cruz killed. Talking gets everyone killed." "You're already locked up," Jensen pressed. "What more can they do to you?" He gave a bitter laugh. "You think the walls keep us safe? Lady, the walls belong to them. The guards decide who eats, who breathes, who makes it to morning. You cross the line, you don't just die, you vanish. No paperwork. No grave. Just gone." His words sent a chill crawling down Jensen's spine. She'd felt the danger before, but hearing it laid out like that made it sink deeper. Blackridge wasn't a prison. It was a closed world with rules carved in fear. Still, she leaned in. "Cruz trusted you. He left you hints. You don't have to give me names. Just tell me, was it Bennett?" For a moment, Little D's eyes flickered. His lips parted as though he might say it. But then he froze. His gaze shifted past Jensen to the small reinforced window in the door. A shadow moved outside. He clamped his mouth shut instantly, shaking his head. "Interview's over?" he muttered. Jensen turned just as the door opened. A guard she didn't recognize stepped in, his hand resting on his baton. "Time's up," he said curtly. Little D looked at her with a kind of desperation she hadn't seen before. Not anger. Not defiance. Just fear. Jensen stood, frustration burning in her chest. Another wall. Another silence. Later, in the mess hall, she tried a different approach. Walking slowly between the tables, she scanned the faces of inmates who fell silent as she passed. Some stared at their trays. Others followed her with narrowed eyes. She stopped at one table where a group of older lifers sat, their tattoos faded, their stares heavy with experience. "You all know who killed Cruz?" she said, her voice just loud enough to carry. "You know why. And you know what's being brought into this prison. If you want this place to burn, stay quiet. But if you want it to end, talk to me." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then one man leaned forward. His voice was gravel, worn down by years of cigarettes. "You think you can end it?" he asked. "You're one cop against an army. The code doesn't just cover guards. It covers us too. We bleed, we suffer, we die, but we don't talk. Not if we want to see another sunrise." He jabbed a finger at her. Cruz forgot that. And now he's gone. The others nodded, their faces hard. Conversation resumed as if she hadn't spoken at all. Jensen walked away, her mind racing. Both sides, the guards and the inmates, were bound by the same law of silence. Cruz had broken it and he paid the price. Now anyone who dared follow would face the same fate. That night, as she reviewed her notes in her makeshift office, Ramirez staggered in. His face was pale, sweat beading his forehead. "They're watching us," he whispered, closing the door behind him. "I saw Bennett talking to 2 others in the yard. They kept looking at me." One of them made a throat-cutting gesture. Jensen's stomach dropped. The noose was tightening. She reached for the evidence bag again, the scrap of cloth crinkling in her hand. It was proof, but it wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed someone willing to shatter the code. Her phone buzzed. A message, untraceable, no number. Just 5 words. "Basement. Midnight. Come alone." Her pulse quickened. Could be a trap. It probably was a trap. But it could also be the break she needed, the one voice willing to break the silence. She stared at the message, the freezer discovery fresh in her mind, Bennett's smirk still burning in her memory. At midnight she would go. And whatever waited in that basement, she knew one thing. The code of silence was about to crack, or crush her.